Hello, this is the weekly news downdate here with your host, Mr. Emo Syndicate and Mr. Voiceover News Guy. Now, today we're going to be in Johannesburg, Southern Africa. Now, we're going to talk about Rhodesia and their raids on Zambia and Botswana. Now, to give you some brief context and overview. Rhodesia, a country in Southern Africa or Southern Africa, was divided into a big Rhodesia, but has now since become Northern Rhodesia, which has become Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia, which has become Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Now, the Rhodesian security forces have been fighting a long 10-year war of a bush war against the People's African Zimbabwe Union, or ZANU, and the People's Union of ZAPU. Now, one was headed by Mr. Joshua Nkomo and the other one by Mr. Robert Mugabe. Now, the Rhodesians have now started to have multi-racial voting this week, as you can see in the towns of Salisbury and Zambezi. Now, only time will tell if these votes are actually properly counted or fraudulent. There are 2.5 million black voters to 150,000 white voters, including the security forces on the border of Rhodesia. Since Portugal has left the colonial war and colonies in general, Rhodesia has been surrounded by now Mozambique, Angola, even South Africa secretly, but they're secretly, covertly being funded by South Africa, which still denies it to this day, and of course they're surrounded by Zambia and Botswana, though having been neutral, are still staging areas, especially in the bushes, for ZANU and ZAPU. Now we take it to Mr. Emo Syndicate on the ground, where he is going through the raids of Mr. Nkomo today, and we'll see something we might not have seen before. Anyway, to you, Mr. Emo Syndicate on the ground. Johannesburg, the 13th of April today, 1979. Rhodesia sent raiders into neighboring Zambia and Botswana today to attack the command centers of guerrillas who have vowed to disrupt elections in Rhodesia next week. At least 10 people were reported killed. In a 3 a.m. strike in Lusaka, the Zambian capital, Rhodesian commandos disguised as Zambian soldiers wrecked several buildings in an attack apparently aimed at capturing or killing Joshua Nkomo, one of the two principal Rhodesian guerrilla leaders. A bungalow where Mr. Nkomo lives was destroyed in the raid, but the guerrilla leader escaped injury. At first, Zambian officials and guerrilla aides said that Mr. Nkomo had not been at home during the attack, but Mr. Nkomo insists later that he had escaped during the gun battle. No words on Rhodesian casualties. The report that at least 10 people were killed and 12 people wounded in Lusaka and in the Lusaka raid was made by the Zambian officials, but they did not say whether or not any senior aides of Mr. Nkomo were among the casualties. There were no official words on the Rhodesian losses, but some sources in Salisbury, Rhodesia's capital, says that the raiders returned without any casualties. They were ferried across the Zambezi River in Land Rovers on pontoons. Other Rhodesian troops dressed in uniforms of the Botswanan Defense Force, or the BDF, drove into Francistown on the border at 1 a.m. and captured 14 of Mr. Nkomo's aides. The officials were in charge of coordinating the passage of guerrilla recruits and refugees from Rhodesia through Botswana into Zambia. At about the same time, Rhodesian attacks destroyed the ferry that crossed the Zambezi River between Botswana and Zambia at Kangsongala, the point where Rhodesia, Botswana, and Zambia meet. A Rhodesian military communique issued in Salisbury said that the ferry had been carrying war material for the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, the arm wing of Mr. Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU. No comment on objectives yet. A Rhodesian military spokesman refused to say what the principal objective of the Lusaka raid and attack was, but it appeared to be similar to that of the raids into Mozambique over the last 3 years, when military units attempted to seize or kill commanders of the other main Rhodesian guerrilla force, which was led by Mr. Robert Mugabe, or ZANLA. On each occasion, the raiders struck the camps where they believed that guerrilla commanders were present, only to find their intelligence information had been faulty. There were speculations in Rhodesia today that the attacks in Zambia and Botswana were part of a military offensive aimed at blunting the guerrillas' plans to disrupt the elections for the black-led government scheduled to begin on Tuesday. The elections, involving 2.8 million black voters and more than 100,000 whites, are to continue for 5 days under one of the most elaborate security operations ever mounted in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The latest drive on the guerrillas today began last month with a series of raids against camps and other targets in Zambia and Mozambique. However, military spokesmen have said that the tree bombing raids this week against the targets in Zambia, which left 350 people killed or wounded, had come too late to have any effect on rebels already inside Rhodesia, preparing to disrupt the vote. A possible motive for today's attacks could have been to demoralize the guerrillas, led by Mr. Nkomo and Mr. Mugabe, and encourage them to defect, as several hundred insurgents have already done so under the government amnesty program. Another motive could have been to avenge the deaths of 107 Rhodesian civilians in 2 Air Rhodesia airliners shot down by Mr. Nkomo's forces in the past 6 months. Witnesses in Lusaka. The attack on Lusaka lifted the sagging morale of around 250,000 Rhodesian whites, some of whom competed it and compared it to the Israeli raid in Entebbe airport 3 years ago. The military command gave few details, but reports from Lusaka indicates that the raiders were probably members of the Seleto or the Siluto Scouts, a unit that operates independently of the army's main force, specializing in assaults across the border. Witnesses in Lusaka said that some of the raiders entered the Zambian capital in Land Rovers, identical to those used by the Zambian army, and bearing the Zambian markings as well. Others reported to have parachuted onto a golf course close to Nkomo's residence. The attackers were described as blacks. Most of the Seleto scouts are blacks, but whites blackened their face for raids across the border. Witnesses said that the raiders were dressed in Zambian uniforms. Later, a Zambian official surveying the remains of Mr. Nkomo's bungalow pointed out that the raiders must have assumed that the barrage of rockets, grenades, and small arms fire would kill the nationalist leader. In recent months, Mr. Nkomo has been altering his overnight stays between the bungalow and other houses in the Zambian capital, but he said after today's attack that he had been in the bungalow at the time, escaping during a 95-minute gun battle. After wrecking the Nkomo house, the attackers destroyed several residences of other officials close to the guerrilla leader. They also destroyed the Liberation Center, an office complex in Lusaka's southern skirts. After wrecking the Nkomo house, the attackers destroyed several residences of other officials close to the guerrilla leader. They also destroyed the Liberation Center, an office complex in Lusaka's southern outskirts that housed the Nkomo wing of the Patriotic Front, whose other wing is headed by Mr. Mugabe. Anyway, this has been the Nightly Evening News. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time, and long live Zimbabwe. Until next time, this has been ENN, reporting from you live, 1979.
Uhuru bwana, si uongo bwana. Kwa kweli watu wote wanatuletea uhuru. Wacha kutangatanga duniani. Oga, 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 oga. Ebo, ebo, oh, ebo, ebo, oh, ebo, ebo, oh, ebo, ebo, oh. Wewe, acha na wewe. Mwachie mtoto, mwachie. Thank you.